Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. What is the minimum that people need to lead a life that's worth living? And hence, or relatedly, what is the minimum that we are obligated to provide to others? My guest today, Nicole Hassoun, has just written a book on exactly these questions. Nicole is a professor of philosophy at Binghamton University and head of the Global Health Impact Project, a research organisation focused on promoting access to essential medicines. She's the author of Globalisation and Global Justice, Shrinking Distance, Expanding Obligations and Global Health Impact, Extending Access on Essential Medicines for the Poor, and most recently, A Minimally Good Life, which is the topic of this conversation. I think we set up the topic as we go, so I don't really need to introduce it much more than that, other than to just say thank you for people who have recently joined to support the podcast on Patreon. Particular thank you to John Rowell for joining at the patron level. That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And yeah, let's get straight to it. This is The Moral Minimum with Nicole Hassoun. Okay, I am joined today by Professor Nicole Hassoun. Nicole, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So just as a brief introduction to you, what are some of the things you like to talk or write or read or think about?
Yeah, I'm really excited about a lot of things. I have a project that I'm starting on how we should respond to the challenges of our times that both draws on some of the ideas in this book about the good life, but also is about access to essential health care and how do we think about the nature of health and well-being and its connection, and then how can we measure that, and how can we promote access to essential medicines, especially in pandemic times, that I'm pretty excited about as well.
Okay, so you mentioned your latest book, which is A Minimally Good Life. First question, why minimally? Why are we making minimum the focus?
Yeah, so I'm giving a what's called a sufficiency theory of justice or basic justice. So what do we owe people as a basic minimum in society is really the question that I'm interested in. And so focusing on that question, I think we need to look at, what lets people live flourishing lives? What do we owe people kind of at least, and it might be that we should help people live even better lives, like great lives, and it would be really nice, and a good social democracy, might do that. But the question is just about like social safety nets, and so I start with that minimum, and then of course we could expand it from there.
So to start with then, as a philosophical question, so what you're saying is we could have a theory about what our ideal society is, what a perfect society is. If we were all maximally moral, how would we treat each other? You're asking a lower bar. What is the minimum that we need to be doing for one another?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm thinking about what do we owe each other, kind of, in light of the like the COVID pandemic and the inflation and the conflict that it's, that we're facing. How do we ensure that everybody has enough, right? What is the basic minimum for people? And we might, in some societies that are really fortunate, be able to help people do a lot more than this. But I think everybody should at least be able to live a good life. And so that's the thesis of the book. And then, I give some arguments for why I think that's so.
How would you even go about working out what that is, though? Because, there's John Rawls has what he calls a thin conception of the good. You get socialists, they'll sort of give you a number. It's this income. That's the minimum that people deserve. You can imagine not just that there's a range of answers on what utopia might look like, but there's a range of answers on what and a libertarian might say, no, nothing. We're not entitled to give anything to anybody. So what is the process? What's the steps you would take to start to arrive at an answer, of even to sketch out what that minimum would look like?
Absolutely. So yeah, there's some people who think we don't owe people any basic minimum at all. And my first book talks to some of those people, and I say, even by your own lights, you should think there's some basic minimum. But I hear, I want to go beyond that and say what I think the right basic minimum is, and how we should think about a good life, and why we should focus on welfare rather than just capabilities or resources or institutions or something else. And I think that people need all kinds of things to live good enough lives. So they need some amount of resources like food and water and maybe shelter and education, these kinds of things. But they need good institutions, and they need to be able to shape their lives as well. And so I have a way of thinking about a mechanism for figuring out what people need to live a good enough life. And then I argue against some of the alternatives, like people only need to be able to maybe reach certain threshold, but we don't actually have to help them reach it, right? Like if they can do it on their own, that's enough, and if they choose not to, that's fine. So these kind of capability theories or resource-based theories where you just have to give people certain amounts of stuff, I think aren't adequate. And so the first part of the book explains, like, how do we think about what this basic minimum is, and then why is it the right account of the basic minimum. And then later in the book, I argue that, yeah, this is what we owe people, against people who I think deny that altogether to some degree, but mostly people who think, yeah, there should be some basic minimum. Maybe even yours is the right account of the basic minimum, but might have a different view about what costs we have to bear to help people secure this minimum. So maybe like they think it demands too much to actually help everybody live a good enough life.
Let's start at the beginning. How do we even get to describing what you consider a minimum standard should be? You describe a justifiable aspiration standard. Talk us through that in the simplest terms. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think you can have like different ways of thinking about what a good enough life is, right? So you might think, well, some of those who are really severely disabled, who have huge challenges, maybe they're oppressed or disadvantaged, nonetheless can live really good lives. And I think there's a certain sense in which that's true. And this is a standard of reasonable affirmation. It's reasonable to affirm the lives of some people who are, extremely mentally and physically disabled. They have everything that they could have, right? They might have good friends and people to take care of them, and they can appreciate things and respond to values and the ways they're capable of. But we also have a different sense of the minimally good life, and that's the justifiable aspirations sense. And so, although I think they're both really important, on the kind of theory I'm looking for is one where we say, well, what should people be able to secure, like if it were possible for them, right? So what kinds of lives do people have a justified aspiration to attain? And of course, you might say, well, we could aspire to anything we want, and that seems fine in a certain sense. But what could we claim as a matter of basic rights? Like what kind of life might support a theory of human rights or something? And so I have a way of, again, kind of thinking about that. And the idea is, well, we want to put ourselves into other people's shoes and think, there, but for the grace of God go I. What if I were that person? Is there any serious reason to doubt that the life could be well lived? And so I argue that, like, if we're reasonable, caring, and free, and we have all the relevant information, and we really think about that life from that person's kind of in full understanding of like their history and their psychology and their circumstances, then we're well enough informed to make a judgment about the quality of that life, right? So we have enough information, then we can say, well, is there a serious reason to doubt the life can be well lived? Should I be apprehensive about this, or can I be content? Like, if I had to live that life as that person, if I were them, would it be, good enough? And I think we can sometimes say yes, and sometimes there are really serious reasons to doubt that somebody's life might go poorly for them. And in that case, their life won't meet the threshold for justifiable aspiration in kind of the technical sense I'm talking about.
When you imagine the person who's making that decision, as in the person who is making the evaluation of what would I, as you say, would I be content if this were my life? Would I feel like I had achieved some sort of minimum?
Actually, that's kind of a little different than the question. So
Go
it's like,
ahead.
right now, would you be content to live that life? Not would you be content once you were that person? So we need to
Mm,
be doing this from a second person perspective. Like we are not that person,
right.
but we're thinking about their life. And the reason for that is we don't, if you were the person who was abused, but you had like adapted to your circumstances and come to like love your abuser, well, maybe you would be happy then. And you need to know that, right? Like you would say you wanted to stay in that situation, but we still judge that, well, there's something wrong, right? That person shouldn't have to be in the abusive situation in the first place. So, like, there are serious reasons to doubt that life can be well lived because that person's extremely abused. Maybe they're, you know, getting their bones broken all the time or something, right? Like that's not a good enough life. And so we need that distance from that person's perspective.
Or merely strongly indoctrinated to
Yes.
believe that that's the life that's sort of what I'm driving at when I talk about the agent making the decision. I'm not talking, or you're not talking, we're not talking about individuals in all states of the world, right? We're saying the people who we would sort of trust to make the determination of what the minimum standard are must themselves meet some minimum thresholds in order to qualify, right?
Yeah, they have to be reasonable and they have to be caring and free. And so to be reasonable is to be appropriately impartial. So you have to care about others also. You can't just, if you didn't care about yourself, others, you might set a really low standard for people. And so you need to be responsive to the needs at stake and give them due weight, right? And then, so not only impartial, but caring, and then also free to make these judgments. So you're not coerced or manipulated or deceived in any way when you're making this judgment. You have both internal and external kind of capacities and freedom necessary to decide whether that person's life is good enough, right, to make that judgment.
So, as a philosophical analogue, I suspect many listeners will be familiar with Rawls's original position. Rawls is also not saying I'm going to empirically look at what actual human beings say their sort of minimum standards are. We're going to imagine an abstracted individual. You're saying not quite as abstracted as Rawls, perhaps real people in your case.
Yeah,
But nonetheless, there have to be some parameters around how those people are situated and how they're thinking, principally that they're reasonable, they're caring, and they're free. Do I sort of have that right?
Absolutely. So the idea is like to give us a way of thinking about other people's lives, what standards we should have for social welfare for people. That we can use in the actual world. So nobody, of course, is going to be perfectly impartial, perfectly caring, right, perfectly free. But we can all, I think, approximate this to more or greater degrees. And when we do a good enough job, right, and then we're given all the relevant information and we're able to empathize with the people appropriately, I think we can sometimes actually come up with good judgments about life quality and what people need for a basic minimum. And I give this example of someone with like trachoma in the book, who's a new immigrant to the United States, right? And so the trachoma is a disease that can blind you. If they don't get treatment for it, then they'll probably go blind. And the question is, are there serious reasons to doubt this life can be well lived in this context? Well, you're a new immigrant to the States. Maybe you don't speak the language. Maybe you don't have an adequate support system. Maybe you're not eligible for social welfare, and our social welfare system is inadequate to ensure that you're going to live a good life even if you're blind, right? Like there's serious reasons to doubt that life can be well lived because people who are blind suffer from a variety of different problems that person may be unlikely to cope with well enough. And so I think we can, think about these harder cases and say, yeah, probably, even, treatment for or prevention of, blindness from trachoma would be part of a social welfare package, because otherwise some people's lives are going to be at risk.
Okay, so to continue my contrast with Rawls, you're not imagining purely abstract individuals or like a thought experiment. You are imagining real people in the circumstances of this world having these sorts of conversations about what a minimum standard is that we can ask for other people. But it's not all people in the world, because, as we say, people may be acclimated to circumstance or indoctrinated, so on and so forth. But you imagine people possessing these qualities of reasonableness, care, and freedom, deliberating not in abstraction but in the circumstances of the world and coming to some sort of shared account. Do I have that sort of right?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, whether we need deliberation and debate depends on when there's disagreement and what we're trying to do. So like policymakers might deliberate or have debate, but if you're confronted with a constituent, say in your office as a senator, like saying, hey, like I have a problem, I can't access this, benefit from the state. Well, does a person need it to live a good enough life? I think that standard, could help somebody think through this appropriately. Okay, am I being impartial? Am I caring enough about these interests? And, is there anything affecting my judgment here? That shouldn't be. And then, am I empathizing appropriately? Is this reasonable? These kinds of questions would then hopefully guide people in their own deliberation. And then when we disagree with other reasonable or seemingly reasonable, caring, and free people, we can have these conversations and say, hey, but like, is that caring enough, right? Like, are you giving that person's, what if it were you, right? What if you were that person? Would you be content to live that life? And help people kind of get a grasp on what's a good enough basic minimum. And I do this exercise with my students in their classes sometimes where I use Rawls's veil of ignorance, except for I'm like, you're going to be this person. You don't know who it's going to be. And you put them in that person's shoes. And then you say, okay, well, would you be happy enough, like, without having developed that list of human rights? I have a hard time thinking that Rawls, would want to live with just his minimal set of rights in the international stage, if he ended up being female and maybe located in a country where women weren't treated very well.
Talk to me about the word caring. That struck me as a difference to. Yours isn't exactly a contract theory, but although it contains some structural parallels. But in many contract theories, we sort of assume a sort of egoistic, rational individualism of what the parties are motivated by. It's very important to you that your deliberators are caring. Why is that, and what does that do for the result?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I follow Nussbaum here. I think that this is an essential bit of it, because like I said, if you might be impartial, you might want to live with other people on fair terms, but what if you don't give yourself any weight? Or what if you don't give, anybody's interest much weight? That seems compatible with the kind of rationality and even reasonableness that Rawls talks about, without ensuring a adequately high kind of basic minimum. So I draw on, I guess, some feminist care theorists to talk a little bit about this, but caring is actually really a difficult thing to do, right? So you want to promote people's interests, you want to understand them and address their needs when you're caring, but it can require like flexibility and restraint, as well as actually helping people, or actually, you might have to help people help themselves to care about them appropriately. So when you start thinking about what people need, I think understanding, having a good idea of what it means to care well for each other is important, because maybe you want to ask them what they need in order to figure out how to help them, or maybe you actually have to go beyond asking and just help people sometimes, and they can't help themselves. So I think Engster put it, this way: you have to be attentive, responsive, and respectful of others to really care about people. And so, because a lot of my theories, like moral ground, is relational, I think that we stand in important relationships of care and concern to others, and we need to stand in those relationships in order to make possible for ourselves, like all the fruits of human civilization and cooperation. And a lot of the value of taking up this perspective comes from the importance of care for ourselves and for others.
Do you want to talk a bit more about relationships, actually? Because I'm sort of in the process of writing an article about like the meaning of life, which is, no small topic, right? And one of the things that kind of struck me, just an idea I'm bouncing around in my head right now, is if you sort of ask people about grand meaning, you'll often get big world-changing projects, Caesar weeping at the statue of Alexander and all that. But probably, just like empirically, if you looked at what actually people find meaning in their lives, it's probably relationships for the most part. Family, romantic relationships, friendships. That's probably where most people, most of the time, cleave out meaning. And you put a lot of focus on this in your book. You talk in terms of the bare minimum. Certainly, you're not neglecting the minimum financial standard of living or healthcare or stuff like that. But you also talk a lot about relationships. What work are they doing for you?
Yeah, I mean, so I say, look, people are different. They need different things to live well enough, right? So different societies, different social situations, different kinds of people, right? Like we're all going to need slightly different things. Although of course we all need some of the same things like food and water. But there's some things that typically like contribute to our ability to live well enough. And these things that make our lives good include relationships, maybe also pleasure and knowledge and appreciation and worthwhile activities. So yeah, so I agree with you. I think that it's not just like hedonistic pleasure, for instance, that makes our lives good. That we find a lot of importance in actually having good relationships with others, but kind of separately from them, these relationships being part of what makes our lives good enough. I think I want to argue that we have to stand in these relationships. That's kind of the foundation of what I call our common humanity. So and these quality relationships, like when they're good and caring and kind and we're free and respectful and so forth, and we're able to work together and cooperate and make amazing things together, those are things that merit respect and concern. And so that is why partly I think we should help people live minimally good lives. It's important for the person, but it's also important for us to stand in these relationships with each other, that people are supported in them, that the relationships are good, and that I think means we should help people stand in those relationships with us and live good enough lives, and that relationships that help everybody flourish together are really they're the ones we should sustain, and the kinds of good relationships that we have obligations to support. Does that make sense?
Yes, but clarify for me, like to what extent relationships are involved. Just to put a question to it, does your account of a minimally good life involve being situated in relationships? Do people have a right to be situated in relationships in the same way that we might think of them having a right to food or sustenance or shelter?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you have to be careful, right? Like nobody has a right to marry you, for instance, right? Like that's not at all what I'm saying. But I think that we to respect and show appropriate concern for our common humanity, we have to safeguard the kinds of relationships that are valuable and kind of help make us all members of our moral community. And these relationships are ones where we give others interests equal and due consideration. And we don't just respect each other as free people that make their own decisions and can respond to contingency as they will. We have to actually recognize people are, we're all just born here, right? And we're all equally, we have free will or we don't. We're all subject to contingency. Like we have to deal with a lot of things. We would not even be here if others didn't care for us when we're infants, right? We all rely on this, and there's going to be times in our lives when we're all extremely vulnerable and dependent creatures. And so given the kinds of creatures that we are, and given kind of the possibilities for us, we have to collaborate and cooperate and kind of hold each other up. And the good way of doing that is to make sure that everyone can flourish together. So that does generate obligations, I think, on us to be reasonable and caring and help people maintain their freedom, but also to help them, when they're vulnerable. Because if no one else is going to step in and fill the gap, then we're going to lose those relationships, or we're not going to have people kind of become part of that moral human community, or we won't recognize them as part of that community if we don't provide them with assistance.
What do those obligations look like? Because this is challenging, right? I think on the one hand, we all recognise how important relationships are to a good and meaningful human life. On the other, it seems to violate some pretty bedrock liberal principles to say you have a right to someone's time or energy or emotion, much less their friendship or romantic love. That doesn't sound right. What I mean, there are people trying to assert that claim. I'm not, but there are people who say things like that.
Yeah.
But if we say yes, we agree, and I'm not just saying this, I think this is right. Relationships are core to a meaningful human life, and we do have obligations to others to want other people to have meaningful human lives. What does that look like in the reality of the world? I can pay for you to have shelter. How am I obligated to help you form relationships?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when you do pay for someone to have shelter, that is, you pay your taxes, you are in a relationship with somebody. So the idea isn't that, okay, there might be people who need certain relationships to flourish, because that is part of a good life. And so if somebody's really lonely, right, and they're really suffering, then providing counseling and providing opportunities for them to connect with others seems appropriate, like as a way of fostering their welfare. But these relationships that support and kind of constitute our common humanity, often they're political relationships. So we participate in creating shared institutions that help people flourish by, I don't know, subsidizing medical care so they can see a counselor, or providing them with food or shelter when they're hungry or homeless. And I think if we put ourselves in their shoes and we think, there, but for the grace of God go I, we're going to think, there's a serious risk to their ability to live well enough if they remain unfed or without sufficient psychological support and sufficient access, at least, to good relationships. I think that we want to incorporate these people into the community, and that allows us it gives us all the potential of the people that are otherwise left out. We lose that as a community when we just let people, they're kind of fall by the wayside, right? So it's not a purely selfless kind of thing. I think it can be partly because we are doing this together, right? We are standing in a common project that makes possible for us, all the fruits of human civilization and the arts and the sciences and so forth. So bringing people into productive relationships with each other in society can help advance our common projects.
Could you also mention, say, a right to education in that sort of framework, in that there's other reasons to assert a right to education, but one of the things it does for young people is it helps form social skills, social bonds, it brings you into community with other people. It ideally should equip you with the skills to make friends, basically, later in life.
Yeah.
Can we sort of assert that sort of good as part of what we're thinking about here?
Absolutely. So I do think we have to have the resources, institutions, and capabilities necessary to secure the things that make our lives minimally good, including not just relationships, but pleasure, knowledge, appreciation, all these things. And so education is a crucial component of that, not just food, water, shelter, but education, certain kinds of social support can help us. And kind of the resources kind of component, but education also helps support our capabilities, and it's part of the kinds of good institutions that support, our development. So yeah, absolutely, that seems right to me.
What do you make? This isn't core to your book. It's just something that I've sort of crossed paths with recently. What do you make about the various debates we're having about this younger generation, people who are, say, in their 20s now, being affected by a sort of quote-unquote crisis of loneliness? People, and there does seem to be some statistics to bear this out, have smaller friendship groups, are entering into relationships less, seem to spend much more time digitally, much less time in person. It does seem like something real is changing there. I'm also a bit cautious of many of the political narratives that are built on the back of it. I think particularly some of the narratives that are built about young men's loneliness can have a tinge, and sometimes more than a tinge, of misogyny to them. But it doesn't seem completely fake that people are forming relationships less. So I don't know if you've had any thoughts on that, just relating to this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've thought a lot about the younger generation. I often think about the elderly generation and their social isolation, say during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I mean that too, definitely. Yeah.
Absolutely, like in certain ways, as we move toward a more individualistic and like, I don't know if it's classical liberal, but like approach, right? And we think of everybody as responsible for their own happiness in a way, and we owe people very little. We're all free people, but we do as we will. I think that it's a result of the evolution of technology and our inability to kind of figure out the ways in which that can enhance our lives and the ways in which it doesn't contribute to our lives, and respond to it, appropriately. Like, all of us are sucked into our phones for 3 or more hours a day. I mean, is that really helping us flourish, or is that subtracting a great deal from the quality of our lives? I think people recognize it's a question, but we haven't got a solution. Even if we come to the conclusion that it's not a good idea, how do we unplug? It's very difficult. But I think, it can also be a reflection of certain kinds of features of society. So although, like, I was in Finland last year at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and I think people there, they have a very different relationship with technology. They are using it, but not constantly. Like, it doesn't seem like they're addicted in the exact same way that Americans are addicted. And I don't know, I'm not sure if that's the difference in the technology or a difference in the culture and beliefs, but I think there's a lot more communal organization and opportunities and ways in which the society is like physically organized to connect people. So I think that there are some very fundamental things you might want to think about the way we structure our society to address maybe the loneliness epidemic, because of course, like, even those who are in families and maybe living in communal settings, they might be lonely too, right? And there might be ways of, and I say something kind of offhand in the book, but I actually think it's kind of true that, like, many of us would do a lot better for just inviting someone who needs it over for Christmas, right? Like, that's a weird thing, but over for dinner, right? So if we reach out to each other and form these relationships, it's not always, like I said, it's not always like selfless. It can enrich our lives. Like, if people participate in protests or social change, they often enjoy it immensely, right? It's a fun thing to do. So you can get a lot of value out of giving as well as receiving in these relationships and improve your life.
Yeah, and I think the thought I would follow on from that is that the problem, to the extent that there is a problem, isn't just sort of structural, it's also ideological. Like, what's your vision of the world? What obligations do you think you have to others? Because, as you say, if you do think you have at least some obligations to others, you're probably more likely to reach out to them. What do you think, the relationships, the governing norms should be between people? Do you think you're better than others because of your race or gender or caste? That might get in the way of your ability to form, that almost certainly will get in the way of your ability to form meaningful relationships. It's also a matter of what we believe. And I wonder if, alongside the structural digital stuff, we've become more individualistic and not always in a good or productive way.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the communitarians had something against like the liberal view in a certain sense. Like, where are the sources of value in our lives? How do we think of ourselves? Is our flourishing really independent of everybody else's? Like, how would we do if everybody else was doing poorly? I think we can, I don't know if other people feel this way or not, but I think for me, it's like, if people ask you, like, how do you think people are doing right now? Not that well, right? And that affects you. And other people are not doing well. Maybe it's just in the way you interact with them, whether they're honking at you when you're on the road, or grumpy with you at the counter of the grocery store or whatever. But these larger scale things and how people are doing, I think it really does change how we're doing. And of course, you can see it very clearly in personal relationships, like who's really doing well when their child is suffering. Very few people are unaffected, like, deeply by that. So I think if we think about flourishing as more as a collective endeavor, and what we're trying to achieve is more something we're doing together, then I think we have greater opportunities to improve things, and not everything that we give is a sacrifice.
What do you say to someone who just denies all of that? Because we're talking a fairly broad range of sets of concern for, obligation towards others, right? There are people, not so many in political philosophy, but certainly politicians and real world people, who at a basic level don't think we have obligations to others, or at the very least it's a very minimal form of obligation as non-interference. I'm not even talking liberalism here, but like libertarianism. You write in your book, I'll quote you back to you, you write, quote, "I reject libertarianism because it has too impoverished a view of our common humanity." Explain.
Yeah, I mean, so I do think they think of people as these free, autonomous people. I argue in my first book that in order for people to, have this freedom, they're going to need food and things that keep them alive. And so actually argue that libertarians should recognize some kind of basic minimum. But in this book, I'm kind of like, oh, I'm done with you. I'm a little bit done with the libertarians. I was in school in Arizona, and, I wrote a whole book, and I feel like that's enough airspace for that. So although I don't engage, I don't engage that much with those who would deny there's any basic minimum. There's still a broad range of people who disagree. And so anyone who thinks, okay, there's some basic minimum, maybe it's really just emergency care, at the medical center, I'm willing to kind of engage with in this book. Take George Scherer, for instance. So he has a very different view of what we owe to people. I talk a lot about in the book, and he thinks we have to help people live their lives efficiently. So the basic minimum isn't going to require much, because people should be able to respond to like the reasons their situation presents within their capabilities. And so we have to help them get to the level at which they can respond to reasons. But then further wealth and resources and so forth are not really going to be that helpful for that person, because they can leverage, their whatever bit of wealth and so forth they have to further improve their abilities, and that's enough. So you can imagine someone like barely making it, right? But who has those capacities, and it would just take them forever, right? To crawl up, from barely working class. Like, I have friends like this, barely started getting jobs at Starbucks, started going to college, got hit by a truck and ended up below the effectiveness principle again. But like, maybe they would have, made it eventually at the end of their life to, like, I don't know, retirement. But then there's others of us who have so much, and you're already at the effectiveness principle, and like, can you leverage it to do amazing things? And I want to say there's something deeply wrong with this view, and it, I think, has to do with kind of the way he thinks about human agents. So what is important is having this ability to reason and plan and so forth, and see ourselves as continuing subjects of a life, for sure. But I'm like, well, there are people who can't reason and can't plan and never will, and yet those people still need food and water and things, right? And I think we have to help those people, and then others are going to need an immense amount, and maybe it would end up requiring us all to sacrifice our ability to live even minimally well to help those people. And I don't think we have to do that. So So it's not clear whether it would really demand very little to help people. And then is that all we owe people? Well, if you think of ourselves as like the only thing valuable about us is our ability to respond to contingency alone, then maybe. But if you think like we are all interrelated, right? And it's not just our ability to respond alone that matters, but our ability to kind of respond together. And we need help through contingency, and we want people to like flourish and not just barely scrape by as agents or maintain their agency, then you get a very much more robust, view of the basic minimum. So I guess I didn't really go through all the details of my argument against share, but there are just kind of two ways of looking at what's valuable, I think, that underlie this. And
What is
I
what
think,
is valuable about human nature? You talk a lot about our shared humanity. What is valuable about that then, if it isn't merely our rational choice making capacities? I think that is valuable to a degree, but it's not the only thing. What's our list?
yeah, I mean, so
Big question, but
yeah, it's a really big question, right? So I think being agents matters, but we're vulnerable creatures who have needs, right? And those things matter about people. It's not just how we can respond to our you know our circumstances. If even if we can't respond, the fact that we're sensitive creatures, we suffer, we feel pain, um, that matters. Um, and I guess, the fact that our lives are so contingent, that we are so vulnerable, and we need others, I think gives us at least some claim to help, or we can't live well enough without each other. And I think that's true for every single one of us. So it's just a matter of treating other people as kind of equals in this respect. Like, what would you want if you were in that situation, or when you are in that situation? I think we should have the same standard for what we have to give as what we can claim ourselves. And so if you want to ignore this tragedy in our situation and the fact that you're going to be vulnerable for a while, then you might end up with a situation like we had before the Affordable Care Act, where like, okay, you're going to be fine until you get cancer, but you're going to get something. And if it happens to come to you a little bit young, you're screwed, right? You're not going to have health insurance. You're going to lose your life savings. Your family's going to go into debt. And, who knows if you're going to survive? Probably not, right? Whereas you might have been able to under a better organized, institutional system with health insurance for all.
So how does that as a foundation work into the universalism, or I guess you could just say geographic scope of our obligations to others? Because if we're building upwards from human beings are choice making and they can be rational, but we're also social creatures, we can also be vulnerable, we also need other people, people can go in very different directions with that thought, right? Some communitarians will say, well, look, you value your family first, obviously, then your community, and then they'll just work outwards from there. But obviously the people closest to you, your community, your countrymen, so on, they get priority. On the other end of the spectrum, you could have someone like Peter Singer who would say, no, in virtue of the fact that people suffer, I mean, you would probably go a bit thicker than just a utilitarian suffering, but still, in virtue of the fact that people suffer, there really isn't a salient moral difference between helping a child in your own community and helping a child across the world. There may be practical differences, but in principle, it's the same weight on the utility scale. So between those two extremes of course we care for those people who look like us more, and all hashtag all lives matter, how do you reason outwards from that foundation?
Yeah, I don't like the hashtag. Yeah. I think it's a disrespect, the people who are pointing out that their lives also matter. But in any case, let's skip that. I do think that these can amount, our obligation to others can amount to obligations of global justice for a variety of different reasons. That is, like, they apply internationally. Because I think the relationships we stand into one another are international, and that we don't only have a sort of a system of coercive institutions internationally that subject people to rules, which, I guess in order to be legitimate, those institutions, I think, should help people meet their basic needs. But I think that the basic claims we have to one another are kind of universal. That everyone has this kind of shared common humanity and respect and concern for us. This requires us to help people when no one else is doing it. Now, we have a system of states organized to kind of help fulfill those obligations, and it's true that states are often, at least, best placed to kind of help their citizens, and we are best placed to help our co-nationals. And so, the first order obligations, I think, that are correlative to these like obligations of justice rights or human rights obligations fall on states. And it's only when their states are not able to help people that other states and the international community should try to fill that gap. But then there's times when even that seems like it's not working. I would say often it's not working. And so what we have to do as individuals, because in the first instance, right, it's like, us, right? We all share this common humanity. We're the ones that make the institutions. We're the ones that stand in these relationships to each other. Then we need to fill the gap. And so these can generate, like, I guess, obligations of charity or obligations to build institutions on individuals when those institutions are lacking. So I don't know if that is helpful. You could reject all of that, and maybe you could say that somehow the relationships we stand in to our compatriots are so much more important that we're never going to get beyond that. And we might say we're never going to get beyond that, and so we have to just focus on getting social welfare in place. But it's, I guess,
I don't really buy that, though. Do you?
No, absolutely not. Because think about it, like peace, international peace is so important for all of our lives where we have it, right? It's not working in Ukraine right now, but that is a function of not our compatriots, right, providing it for us. It's a function of us not being involved fighting with people who are not our compatriots. And the fruits of civilization, again, like those are not just given to us by our compatriots. We have numbers that came from ancient India, right? And then we're picked up by the Arabs, and then now make our computers work. So it's extended in time and space, all of the benefits we have in our society.
I also find the way people make that argument to be very, very ahistorical, and you can debate how much historical accuracy matters with these things. But I think to the extent that we see the nation state as the forum for achieving a particular welfare project or rights project, that's an argument of practicality, right? The state is the machinery that's there, and there's actions I can take, voting, whatever, that at least in theory influence how that machinery is used. It's the tools that we have, right? But it's not the only tools, as you mentioned. There's all sorts of international bodies and so on. I think where people who make the argument we both sort of alluded to want to come from is they want to say that being citizens of a state with someone is almost in some ways analogous to having a family. Like of course Peter Singer, I am not going to treat my child exactly the same as a stranger's child. Of course I have a preference to my own child. Fine, I can grant that easily. A state is not a family. A state is not a naturally arising institution. Indeed, as we think about states, they're quite a modern thing, maybe early modern, and really the nation state as we know it is a product of the age of European imperialism. It's not some natural or inevitable thing. I think there can be a tendency in political philosophy, Nozick, right, just assumes these natural monopolies on violence will appear. Philip Pettit, who I like a lot in his latest book on the state, kind of just assumes, I think, that they're always just sort of going to come about. But they don't. There's a lot of different forms of human organisation in history that, at a first pass, we can sort of think of them as equivalent to our states, but they're actually quite different in a lot of important ways. And the states that we have now, and nationalism as we know it, is, I think, just a matter of historical contingency. It's path dependency. This is the world we happen to be in.
Yeah.
Like if some decisions were made differently in the Middle Ages, we might not be here. We might have a very different macro form of political organisation. Yeah. So I think you can say, so to put a conclusion to that, I think you can say, as a matter of practicality, the state is one of the big tools that we have, and it makes sense to think in terms of the state. Sure. I don't think you can say, as a matter of human beings, this is like a natural thing, and we naturally just feel closer to our co-citizens. If we feel closer to our co-citizens, it's because of ideology and propaganda. It's not because of like natural familial bonds or anything. I just don't think that argument is historically true. Anyway, that's what I think about that.
Yeah, no, it seems very plausible. Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think if it was the case we were living under different institutions, or when in the future people are, then of course the primary obligation bearers, as currently recognized by international law, wouldn't exist, and so there would probably be other institutions that would have those primary obligations. Maybe it's an empire or a city-state or something. That's just some kind of form of social organization that's like particularly effective and helping people kind of meet those needs, and then people would still have obligations to build institutions and do other things to do a better job where that's needed. So although I talk about, kind of states assuming the international order is as it is, it's definitely not,
It seems like it's going to be here for the medium term, at least.
A little bit.
Do you think political philosophy, or just our debates we have about egalitarianism and justice, can sometimes overly assume the state? That someone like Rawls seems to have very much in mind that the nation state is the forum of justice as he wants to achieve it, and Go ahead.
Well, I think you're right in a certain sense. Like, you can theorize, well, if given the limits of X, Y, and Z states and the international community, this is the most we should, say justice requires. And I think that can be very true, right? But usually you're assuming feasibility constraints, which we should challenge in some cases. And this is true at all levels of analysis. It doesn't have to just be about states, but, rationing scarce health resources. Well, if we have to ration, we ought to do it this way. That might be true, but the question is, do we have to ration in this case? Is there something else we could do? And so I think it's very important to challenge the kind of assumptions of a theory in order to see, like, is that is that really what we should do, all things considered, right? And kind of do ideal theory for the real world. That is, given the actual feasibility constraints that exist, kind of as laws of nature, maybe, like, only that, right? If it's a human institution, well, it's something we could change. It may not be easy, and so there's a question of under what time period, we're talking about, but it's not an immutable fact of nature, right? So.
You talked about rethinking and not just accepting at face value. If someone says, oh, there's this constraint or that constraint, to at least an obligation to at least interrogate that. Shall we end with this? What do you mean by creative resolve, and how would you think about it in this context?
Yeah, I mean, so end of the book. So I guess I'll highlight, briefly. The book goes from once I argue that we should help people live minimally good lives, and when our own ability to live such life is not on the line, against a variety of people, not just George Scher, but others who think, well, maybe we just have to do our part, or maybe we just have to give up what won't affect our life quality at all. I argue for this kind of Peter Singer-like view. It's just like Peter Singer light, hopefully with a more robust conception of welfare and a little estimating account of what we have to give up for others. Once I argue for that, then I'm like, okay, here's how we should help people in present and future generations, and try to explain why long-termism is wrong, and we should reject the repugnant conclusion, and we can come up with a more kind of nuanced view of how we should help people meet their needs than prioritarianism even. I then go on to say, well, what do we do in a world that just seems utterly tragic, where there's like millions of people who are suffering and dying, and living in vast.
I like Peter Singer light, by the way. Yeah. Vibes with me, because there is something substantially right that the effective altruists get right, but we maybe want to shade it out a little bit. But I don't want to dismiss what they're saying. Like, there are obligations there anyway.
Well, they went from reasonable to kind of crazy, I think. But I think they made a mistake that's just based on and moral mathematics. So I will, you guys tell you that it exists if you're interested. You can read the book and see like it went from being really a very seemingly humane theory to being one that's like, well, let's worry about aliens in the far distant future. I'm just kidding,
but no, I mean, I think like I think Liam Bright joked on Twitter once that the correct moral position is utilitarian with the proviso no galaxy brain stuff. Like,
yeah. I mean, in this part of the book, I think that people, when you take on this on as more of a rights-based kind of perspective, you think everyone should come into existence with enough, if they're going to come into existence at all, and realize that we can control how many people come into existence. And we don't, more isn't necessarily better, guys. We're like living in a challenged world, right? Like enough is enough. Then you don't end up with these kinds of, we want to maximize the number of people, and therefore we should care about far distant people, and therefore we should neglect people who are currently living. No, you want to help people who are currently living. They currently have their rights not fulfilled. And then, of course, if we have enough, and hopefully we won't have to make tragic trade-offs there, but like if we have enough, we should also have more people who are doing well enough. And since we can affect the number of people, make good decisions. And
I also think there's just, sorry, I've blown us into another area now. There's sort of just an epistemic humility thing, right? Like, it's enough to wrap our heads around what's going on now and to try and do good and avoid harm now. And that's not to say we don't think about the future. I think there's a lot of medium-term threats, be it, you talked about Ukraine, be it climate change, be it, we can think about those. That is it. That is enough. I think we really don't know with the rate of technological change where we'll be 50 years from now. And like that next 50 years is enough to be getting on with in some respects. We don't need to suddenly prioritize a hypothetical worry 5,000 years from now about things that are real and in the present. We will get to that,
Yeah, I mean,
we just need to be real about what we can know, I think, is part of it as well, right?
Yeah, that, and it just seems to neglect like the pressing actual needs of lots of suffering actual people. So I'll put that out there, but at the end I'm like, well, it does seem really tragic, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I blew us off course. Creative.
No, it was me. I blew us off course, but I just wanted to say, it seems so tragic, and so how do we deal with it? And I think that the best response isn't just to kind of be flat-footedly utilitarian about it and go, well, let a lot of people die and maximize the number of people who will live. It is to think more creatively about how we can help people by expanding possibilities, right? And so we should refuse to accept apparent tragedy. Sometimes there'll be real tragedy, and then, of course, we have to accept it and do our best. But we should question the limits of what's possible and kind of think outside of the box and trying to come up with good ways of helping people, and then put those into practice. And I kind of tell some stories about these amazing people who have done this in the past, and greatly expanded access to HIV treatment around the world, or ended smallpox as a pandemic during the Cold War, when it seemed like nobody'd be able to collaborate at all. I'm not sure if that story is in the book. Yeah, and we're currently succeeding in our fight against polio, even in Gaza. Like, I think they got vaccination rates up into the 90% or something. And so I think, with this kind of creativity and resolve, that we can greatly, greatly narrow the scope of tragedy, and that this is, I argue, a virtue that we should cultivate in our challenging times. So yeah, that's basically the book.
Do you feel hopeful in this political moment?
Well,
the answer can be no. Like, I don't. I think sometimes like we feel like we have to. Our political analysis has to end with like a sort of, and here's how we make it all better. I think we live in a very challenging political time.
Yes, but I think you're looking at a very small. I think that the answer to that is to expand the time frame, right? So although we are certainly experiencing great challenges, this is true actually historically almost continually for humans, at least since the agricultural revolution. and now looking forward into the future, of course, we will experience great challenges, but what happens after that is up to us. What happens to us even in the near future is up to us. And so we shouldn't, I think, just say, okay, well, that's it, it's going to be terrible. We're going to do nothing about climate change, right? Like, no, we need to kind of do what we can to address the problems that we're able to address. And that's as much as we can do. So we do what we can, and the rest is not up to us, right?
We do what we can. I can't help noticing, while I don't think it's either or, while doing what we can, that a lot of the trend lines are not encouraging. And I don't just mean structural or whatever. There's a lot of good trend lines you could point about, like rising global health and so on, that you alluded to. When I look at wealthy nations, I see less of what we've talked about. I see the trend line of concern for others, feeling of obligation to others going down, even from a fairly low baseline to begin with. I see nations that are much more hostile to immigration, even to refugees. I find it weird we're having this moment in Syria, and my country, the UK's entire policy, our entire governance for the last decade has been about keeping people in that situation out. We've just had someone elected in America on the promise of mass deportation of tens of millions of people. I think both liberalism and socialism are sort of failing to provide a compelling account of the common good that just succeeds in the test if people adopt it and that they act on it. I think people are, I'm not saying they should be, I think they're increasingly resigned to the fact that we're not going to do anything about global warming. I don't know. Yes, let's not give up. And I think people don't like it when I say stuff like that because they don't want people to do nothing. I agree, people shouldn't do nothing. I'm not saying accept it. I am saying while not accepting it, I see those trend lines. I don't know.
I agree with you, like, of course, but I also see, so I see all those trend lines and I feel the resignation that you encounter. I think that it can be a function of focusing on the larger problems, but within a narrow time frame. So I would say that, if you think about any particular problem, there's a lot you can do at least at a local level. And if you are willing to expand your time frame and take seriously the fact that, like, it's up to us, there's no reason we couldn't do something different. And you should not refuse to say that just because it seems like it might be impossible. Because, I think it's up to us to hold kind of our leaders to account and to take action where we're able to, and that it's too easy to resign.